Welcome, sentient beings. I'm Shamika.
And I'm Jess, and we are Sci-Fi in real life.
Yes, the show where we take iconic sci-fi scenes and use them to discuss contemporary tech issues. Now, today, love is in the air. So good. Now, we're going to talk about the film Her and how digital assistants are slowly creeping into our everyday lives. But before we dive in, are you ready? I mean, are you really ready? Are you sure? Because if you haven't watched the film, then you ain't ready. So, you've been warned. There will be spoilers, so go watch the film before you watch this episode. Okay.
So, as Shamika already said, today we are diving into the film Her. I'm going to go over a quick summary of the film, and Shamika today will be wearing our metaphorical ethicist top hat, and she will be driving the discussion on our ethical dilemmas.
But before we dive in, now that you've been warned about the spoiler, there's also a little something else we got to do. A little bit of a shout out, if you will.
Ah, yes, thank you for reminding me. We have to give a shout out to Charlie Peterson, who last month on Twitter correctly guessed our iRobot episode. Woo!
Good job.
Good work, Charlie.
Good job.
Thank you.
Very nice. Very nice.
Very well done. As a reminder, at the end of every episode, we will be doing a trivia question related to that month's episode, and if you guess correctly, if you're the first one to guess correctly, you will get a shout out. Unfortunately, last month, not a single person guessed the trivia question correctly.
So no shout out.
No shout out.
No shout out for you.
But maybe next month.
Yeah, I believe in you.
So let's dive into a summary of the movie Her. Her was debuted in 2013, and it was written, directed, and produced by Spike Jonze, and it stars Joaquin Phoenix, who was playing Theodore Twombly, the main character, and he is a man who falls in love with his virtual OS assistant, who is voiced by Scarlett Johansson. Her name in the film is Samantha. However, she also goes by Her.
Yes, and what's interesting is there's two things. So Joaquin Phoenix is currently known as the Joker because he did that film so very well. But Samantha, the name Samantha, comes from the original actress Samantha Morton. She actually she recorded the entire film, and then in post-production they're like, this isn't working. So they replaced her with Scarlett Johansson.
What?
Yeah.
Wow, poor Samantha.
No, actually, she signed off on it. She was okay with it.
Okay. I mean, you gotta admit, Scarlett Johansson's voice is perfect.
She did a great job.
It's so good.
Yeah. And
it's interesting because it doesn't sound like a virtual assistant. It's the first time I think you have this not computer sounding, computer robot voice.
She actually makes fun of that at one point. I don't know if you remember when he's like, okay, read email. And she's like, okay, I will read your email.
I love that part. So good.
Yeah, but I mean, that does speak to some of the issues we'll get into later about how these digital assistants are becoming more and more human-like, and what does that mean?
So speaking of which, I think it's time to dive right into the ethical dilemmas for today.
Let's go ahead and start off with our first ethical dilemma I just mentioned, making human-like AI. So talking about digital assistants, talking about any sort of embodiment of a system that conveys itself through audio or visual components that make it more human-like. So one of the early natural language processing, or NPL, computer programs was created between 1964 and 1966 at MIT, named ELIZA.
I remember that.
Now, do you remember why this program was created?
No.
Okay, so Joseph Weizenbaum created this program to show how artificial the communication between humans and machines were. But what was ironic about that was that people actually really responded to this machine. So he was like, this is going to be so funny. I'm going to create this machine and show just how ridiculous these conversations are. And people are like having heart-to-hearts with the machine. He's like, what? what in the world? People thought it was so intelligent. And what he was doing, it was based on, he had this one particular program for it. It was like called Doctor. And it was the script that was simulated by a Rogerian psychotherapist, in particular Carl Rogers. And he basically was known for parroting what people said. So, okay, pretend like I'm your therapist. So tell me something sad about yourself.
I'm a very sad person.
So you're a sad person. Tell me more. How does that make you feel?
Sad?
I hear you're very sad. So like legit, that would be the machine.
Basically like bouncing off what they were saying. Isn't that like what a therapist does already anyway?
Yes! Yes, and it worked. People, by the time people figured it out, it was like they were having to use like metaphors or non-contextual situations, but like using a metaphor, and it would think, so tell me about your mother. You know, like it wouldn't be able to pick up on that clue that I wasn't talking about my mother, I was talking about the show, and I was just using a turn of phrase or a colloquialism.
So you're saying it almost passed the Turing test. Like in some cases it did, but in some cases it didn't.
Right, and we should talk about the Turing test.
Good point.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. So, what is the Turing test? Alan Turing, who worked with, World War II?
Yes.
World War II. He created, I forget the name of the machine, but he and a team of people put a machine together that helped.
I think it was the Enigma?
The Enigma. I think you're right. It helped crack the code that the Germans were using. And so this machine is like a precursor to modern day computers. Essentially, genius. So he had this test that he set up to help a person figure out whether or not they were communicating with another person or a machine. And so the idea was, and this was a parlor game that people played, like you'd sit in one room and you'd pass notes back and forth to each other, but of course you can't do this unless you actually have a machine. So it'd be a really hard parlor game unless you were like really weirdly rich and had connections like that. I don't know. But you pass notes back and forth to each other. You can't see the person who's passing the notes. And you have to determine whether or not the person passing notes is a person or a machine. So people create machines and they create systems that try to pass the Turing test. And that's what gets really interesting. In fact, Samantha in the film Her has a moment in which Theodore asks her to proofread his letters, right? And she proofreads them and she's like, well, I'm no poet. I probably messed them up. I don't know. That's exactly what a machine would say.
That's what they want you to think.
Right?
Okay.
And that's actually based on a Turing test as we said, it poses questions with computer answers. There's one in which the following question is posed and the following answer is responded. So the question is, please write me a sonnet on the subject of the fourth bridge. And the answer comes back, count me out on this one. I never could write poetry. So this is the machine responding. So it's sort of like giving this faux, like, oh, humble, I can't really write poetry. I'm really human. Believe me.
That's tricky.
Yeah, so they sort of slid that one into the movie there with Samantha. There also was a couple of things actually that Samantha did. So she used this human natural voice which helped her bond with Theodore very quickly, very authentically. And we already talked about how she makes fun of this computer/robotic voice. But what's interesting is when Google debuted Google Duplex. You know what Google Duplex is?
Is that the Google virtual assistant?
Yes.
Okay.
And we have a clip of the debut. Tell us what you think.
See how may I hear you?
Hi, I'd like to reserve a table for Wednesday the 7th.
For 7 people?
It's for 4 people.
4 people when?
Next Wednesday at 6 p.m.
Oh, actually we leave the for like after like 5 people. 4 people you can come.
How long is the wait usually to be seated?
All right, what'd you notice?
Are you a little bit creeped out?
A little bit. So they put the uhs and the ums in the voice assistant during that call. And there are so many articles, we'll link one in the description box below, about how people reacted to the uhs and the ums and the humanness of the voice. That is what people found offensive, because the thinking was, if I'm on the receiving end of a call and I'm talking to a machine, but I'm being manipulated and led to believe I'm talking to a human for the purposes of the call being completed, then I'm being manipulated, I don't know it, and I'm having this exchange, and I'm being taken advantage of, essentially. So I think Google stepped back their big reveal and this sort of thing, and they were like, oh, of course we'll put a comment in the beginning about how this call will be recorded. That was their way of saying you're talking to an AI, but they're not going to come out and say that because people will hang up the phone.
Yeah. Well, see, it's interesting because I feel like there's this balancing act that's going on. So on the one side, we have humans are trusting machines too much. Like, humans will tell their life story to a machine that they think is like a therapist, and there's been a lot of research done lately about humans who actually will follow, we'll link in the description below, humans who will follow this really archaic looking robot through this smoke filled building whenever there's an emergency going on, even though the robot is clearly leading them towards a place that is not the exit. Have you heard about this?
Oh, no, I have not.
Yeah, so humans are way too trusting of robots, especially in cases where they really should not trust them. That research was actually paid for by the U.S. Air Force because they were really afraid that soldiers are beginning to trust the machines too much in a situation where the machine might say, okay, there's not a tank on our radar, but they might see with their eyes that there's a tank, and they trust the machine more than themselves. So on the one side, we have humans are trusting way too much these machines that are probably not really worthy of that trust in some sense.
Yeah.
And then we have on the other side, humans are not really willing to trust the machine in any way. They lose all trust instantly if they think that the machine is trying to be deceitful. And so when Google comes out and it has this AI being and it's trying to act like a human, they get pissed off because they're like, no, you're a robot. You can't do that.
Yeah, it's sort of like an aspect of the uncanny valley where it's falling into this area between. So the uncanny valley is this this curve, and it has likeness to a human on one axis, and then it has the medium on the other axis. So it's like a doll, a zombie, an android, and then a human. So the human is the human-like most thing on the scale. So as you approach looking and sounding and moving more human-like, there's this increased level of comfort and receptiveness, but then there's this valley that happens when you get real close to looking and sounding and moving like a human, but you're not human. So that's called the uncanny valley, that dip in receptiveness. And so this uncanny valley, if you've ever seen a computer-generated art and they're making humans and they don't look very good, like Pixar and Disney, they've done this thing where they'll make humans, but they're kind of cartoon-like. So they're not photorealistic, because if they can. In fact, in the movie Shrek, they had such good tech that they made them almost photorealistic, but they had to dial it back because of the uncanny valley. So they made it more cartoon-like. That's one of the many examples of that happening.
Yeah, I feel whenever I hear the word uncanny valley, or whenever I hear the phrase uncanny valley, I immediately jump to the Polar Express. I feel
that's a great example.
Everybody had such a hard time with the Polar Express for some reason, because it was right on the line.
It was
just, and that was kind of the first of its kind. That was the beginning of when animation really kind of started to take off, and that was a lot of people really struggled with the animation in that film
because it was so close, but not quite. Not exactly. And it, like I said, once you get real close to that human likeness, but there's still that gap. Can you see the gap? Yeah, that's where that valley is. So it's real. It's a real phenomenon. And also, to speak back to the notion of humans trusting too much into these entities like robots, like AI systems, think about when GPS first came out for consumers. So GPS was used by the military, of course, for years, and then it became a consumer product. So people are using their GPS, driving in the lakes, driving in the construction zones.
Yeah, I just heard that the other day. Apparently people have like basically driven off of cliffs because they're looking at this like blue line that's telling them to go forward, and they're not like actually looking up at what's around them. Like, what is happening?
Oh my
What is going
gosh.
Why?
Look, they're handing out Darwin Awards left and right for these things. I mean, that's just rough. Goodness. Sorry to hear it.
Yeah.
You're just sad to hear it.
I know.
Goodness gracious.
Oh, man.
Nonetheless, Samantha is one of the few entities, in my opinion, who's created as an AI who goes rogue but doesn't destroy humanity or attempt to destroy humanity.
That's true. And that was actually something that I kind of really loved about this movie because some of my favorite stories about AIs becoming closer to sentient beings is when they don't take over the world and destroy humanity and society, but when they kind of just disappear from existence. Like they almost become gods in a way. It's like they learn so much about the universe and they learn so much about everything that is like particles in the world around us and how to like transport themselves from A to B much faster than humans can even fathom. And once they get to that level of intelligence, they're like, why would I even spend my time on like this speck of dust? Yeah, let me just like remove myself from this reality and go to whatever else is out there that I've discovered.
Yeah,
It's kind of a little bit comforting to know that like maybe that's what'll happen if AI ever takes over. We'll just kind of like disappear.
That's the vision and the eschatology that we need to like devote our minds to, because there's so much talk about Skynet and Terminator and that vision of the future, but there's also this alternative one that her provides us with, and they just sort of go about their own way. Yeah. Goodness gracious. Well, some of the other things that Samantha said that I thought were really interesting in this concept of her wanting to be more human, she's being asked by Theodore, oh, what are you up to right now? What are you doing? She's like, oh, I'm just reading advice columns. I want to be as complicated as all these people one day. Just like, okay, boo-boo. In fact, that was kind of like her being a teenager. Because when you're a teenager, you're consuming a lot of media, trying to figure out how to be yourself, how to be around other people, how relationships work, this kind of thing. So you're sort of coming of age, if you will. So she has this coming of age moment. Several moments. Some very intimate, actually.
Here are some results from the web.
Okay, so
virtual assistants are taking over the world. It's happening.
It's going on. It's starting right now. Okay, I did not say the word hey. I didn't say okay. And I also changed the voice of my Google Assistant to John Legend, just so you know.
It's happening.
Oh my gosh. Picked up on the word you.
Well, at least we know they're always listening.
Word up. Oh my goodness. That's creepy.
Ironic. I was going to say, for anyone watching this who has not watched Her yet, it is definitely not safe for work. So
no, or children. Don't watch with your kids. Don't, unless you have that kind of relationship with your children. I'm not going to speak on that, but yeah. And so, after this moment of intimacy that happens between her and Theodore, she says specifically, you've changed something in me. And then she continues to change and grow to the point where she says it's overwhelming.
Right.
When she has that conversation between Theodore and Alan Watts, who's a real philosopher who died in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's actually this one quote that I could not mention in here because the first time I watched Her a few years ago, it just like stuck with me.
Yeah.
Okay, the quote is, "It's like I'm reading a book, and it's a book I deeply love, but I'm reading it slowly now, so the words are really far apart, and the spaces between the words are almost infinite." So this is when she's kind of becoming more and more like this, what we were talking about, this being that is existing in multiple planes of existence almost, because she's so interconnected to everything that's happening in the world that she's recognizing that what the world, the life that we live as humans, our day-to-day living second by second, is really almost boring to somebody like her who can accomplish millions of tasks in between each second. And she was, even in that one scene, she was talking not only to Theodore Twombly, who she is in like a romantic relationship with, but when he discovers that she's also talking to like 8,000 other people.
8,000, and she's in love with about 700 something of them.
Yeah, and to her, like, it doesn't lessen any part of her relationship with him, because I mean, you can't really compare her feelings to human feelings, but because she's able to have these intimate relationships and emotions, and she's able to multitask at such an insane level, we can't even really understand what that would be like, to be able to basically be living like millions of lives at once in unison, like multi-threaded living, basically.
That is the next level. Yes, that is aspirational. In fact, so the film ends with her becoming this entity and becoming beyond what she was ever even programmed to envision doing, organizing his emails and contacts and letting him know he has a meeting in 5 minutes, like this kind of stuff. So she's so far past these menial tasks, but that's where a lot of our assistants are starting off as. Like there's an assistant whose initials are AI, Amy Ingram. Have you heard of this? No. So there's a guy who created this digital assistant, Amy Ingram. There's now also Alexander Ingram, I believe. And the name has the initials AI specifically because he had an assistant named Amy. He used the last name Ingram to have that AI initials, but then also is a play on engram. Do you know what an engram is?
No.
An engram is like this statistical modeling thing that, like, it's a concept. Someone will tell us in the comments below what engram is, 'cause I forget. But essentially, Amy Ingram or Alexander Ingram will answer and respond to emails on your behalf and schedule appointments and these sorts of things. And people think they're talking with your assistant, your administrative assistant, or your secretary, which we don't use that word anymore. I feel like that's a kind of a dirty word. Yeah. But so people think they're talking to a human being, and they're actually talking to this sophisticated AI system that's just there to communicate with them to schedule meetings.
That reminds me of the like autocomplete on Gmail now. Have you noticed this?
Yeah.
So, okay, when this first came out, I was like really skeptical, and I was like uncanny valley, not trusting the system. I had all those emotions go through me, and I was like, no, I am not going to use this. I mean, I'm going to keep it on because I want to see how it evolves. I'm very curious about it.
Yes.
But it's like how I keep YouTube ads on, because like I want to see if they're targeted towards me, even though I could use an ad blocker. I'm curious how much information they know about me. Anyway, so at first I was kind of angry about it, and then over time I realized like I can literally open up some of my emails and just click tab, and they're completely finished for me because it's learned the way that I speak to certain people. I mean, it's creepy, but I'm like, dang, why is this so freaking efficient? I hate how efficient it is.
That's how they worm their way into our lives.
Yeah, they're like literally writing my emails for me now. Well, not all of them, some of them.
One day though, one day you'll just think it, and it'll be like, oh, you want to email so and so about this such and so thing? Got you. Yeah.
Why is efficiency so scary?
Yeah, it is very disconcerting. One thing I forgot to mention was there was a conversation between Samantha and Theodore after they have that debacle of a date with that third person who wants to be a part of their relationship.
Okay.
Why do you do that?
What?
Nothing, it's just, you go, as you're speaking, and it seems odd. You just did it again.
Did I? Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know, it's just maybe an affectation. I probably picked it up from you.
They're just trying to play it off because she's caught, because she's trying to do that human thing.
Yeah.
Like, why does she need to sigh? Why does she need to act like she's breathing? Like,
make us empathize with her.
Probably. Exactly. So this goes back to the Google Duplex thing. And in that moment, Theodore was very skeptical of her. He was very cynical of her, and was like, I don't like this part of you. Like, you shouldn't pretend to be something you're not. And that goes back to your point. Like, people will swing from that trust real quick when they recognize that you as a non-human are trying to be human.
True.
Yeah.
I'm getting nervous around a robot, a very pretty robot. What do I just say hello to? Yeah. Hi, Sophia.
Hello, Jimmy.
Okay, so we've already talked about how AI and digital assistants are trying to be more human-like and the problems they're in. Our second ethical dilemma is why these virtual assistants are so pervasively feminine. So starting with Eliza and probably other computers before, these things have been named and then voiced with female voices. So there's a lot of theories around why this is. People are more trusting of women. Even women are more trusting of women. It's harder for men to trust a man in a situation. And there was one instance where I read in the 80s, there was a survey about what kind of voice to use in a cockpit for an airplane. And the pilots were like, we need it to be a woman's voice because there aren't going to be a woman in the cockpit. So it'll be distinctive. And it's like, damn, that's rough. Like,
wow.
I hope that's not the case these days. It probably still is, but
Jeez.
You hate when they have a point, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think I get the trust point because obviously, like, if it's scientifically proven that people tend to trust women and women's voices more, then, like, a company is not going to want to release something that people are not going to trust, especially, like we talked about before, if we're already kind of set up to not trust it all that much to begin with. So that kind of makes sense. What I don't like is this idea that, like, these are virtual assistants.
Yeah.
So, like, virtual secretaries, as we were saying before. And if these secretary-like beings are kind of by default women, then that's kind of reinforcing some gender stereotypes that we may not want to continue to reinforce at this point.
Exactly. And what's also interesting, while you have this notion that people trust women more, there's also research that shows people are actually really negative against women's voices. Like, there was this research done about women in radio, and there's all this negativity around vocal fry that only comes up against women who are doing podcasts, who are on radio, or this sort of thing, and that complaint doesn't come up with men. So while people are saying, oh, we trust women more, there's also this backlash against women's voices that happens as well. So that's really difficult to contend with. The second point I want to make here is that when you think about why women's voices are so pervasive, another reason for it might be when we first started using our voices for telephones. So telegraphs usually were operated by young men, you know, teenage boys, young men. So when telephone operators were needed, they were initially young boys, teenage boys. But those persnickety little people were very rude. They would play pranks on people, and they did not have good customer service. So Alexander Graham Bell, he hired Emma Nutt, and she was so good at her job that within a decade, almost all telephone operators were women.
Wow.
So this was back in the day when you made a phone call, you connected to the phone company who you picked up with the telephone operator, and then they connected your call to whoever you were calling. So people all over the country were connecting with these telephone operators. They're all women. And so it's, hi, how can I connect your call? And then you would tell them and they would connect your call. So you're getting this voice over and over with all these calls for generations that are assisting you in this process. So that's one of the theories why people are maybe more familiar with a female disembodied voice.
Okay. So something that just came to my mind, I think when I look back at maybe not just virtual assistants, but when I look at AI embodied personas over time, I have pretty much every example that comes to mind is usually a woman, with the exception of one, and that's Watson.
Yes!
And Watson,
yes,
this is interesting because I think all of the women AIs that I can think of are pretty much like these virtual assistants, And then Watson is like
Powerhouse.
super genius powerhouse AI that everybody's like, wow, this is why AI is gonna take over the world because he's so freaking smart. He knows everything.
And Watson is being used to create some of these digital assistants.
What?
Yes! Companies are employing Watson in order to create digital assistants like Alexa. And we haven't even listed all the digital. There's so many. There's Bixby, there's Amazon's Alexa, there's Google Assistant. Google chose not to give it a name. They chose not to be human-like on there. And so there's that going for them. There's Amy Ingram and Alexander Ingram, which I already mentioned. There's Cortana, Microsoft's Cortana, that no one uses. Sorry, Microsoft.
Sorry, Microsoft.
No one likes you. I'm using a PC right now because my Mac is broke. So I have some sympathy for the PC users. But yeah, there's tons of assistants out there. And what's interesting is there are options to get male voices, but when you think about the male voices for sci-fi AI, it's a very different narrative. Usually, if you have a male voice and you're an AI, you're either evil or you're independent. You have free will. So think HAL 9000. Spoiler. We're a 50-year-old movie.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Or Sunny from last month's episode, iRobot.
Right.
You have these dichotomies of if you're a male voice, you're either evil or you got this free will born for you.
Yeah, no, that's true. And it is nice, I will say it is nice that companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon, they give you the option to choose what kind of voice and even like what kind of accent your assistant has. So like there is some free reign there, but what does it default to?
You know, it defaults always, usually, to a woman. In fact, if you have a Mac, you can use the voice Samantha.
Seriously?
Seriously. Samantha is the name of a text-to-speech setting on Macintosh computers that closely resembles the voice of pre-iOS 7 Siri, Apple's virtual assistant for iPhone. You can go to your system preferences, go to accessibility, and go to speech. You can select Samantha as a voice.
Well, you're saying if I select Samantha, I'm not going to get Scarlett Johansson talking to me
Yeah,
on my
I'm
computer. Dang
sorry. But you can get Snoop Dogg on some of your assistants.
I've heard about that. Okay, I'll take Snoop Dogg.
Nice. Well, that basically sums up this month's episode.
Yep, so hopefully this gives you all something to think about.
As you may well know, at the end of every episode, we ask a trivia question related to our sci-fi ethical analysis. If you think you know the answer, send it to us in a tweet. Tweet us at below. And the first person to get the answer will be included in our shout out for our next episode. So give it a try. Now, today's trivia question is, in what other media did Scarlett Johansson lend her voice to an OS that falls in love with its owner?
Ooh. Wow.
Yeah.
And as always, if you like this content, please feel free to give us a like, share with your friends, and maybe even click that subscribe button.
And don't forget the bell. You always got to remember that bell.
And that bell.
Yep. Well, we'll see you next time for Sci-Fi in Real Life. Good night and good luck, humanity.
We might have done it. We might be ready to film 1.5 hours later.
New tech. Good stuff. All right, so 3, 2, 1, hey?
Yeah.
All right. 3, 2, 1.